Hello and welcome to Under Another Name. In this episode, we're going to talk about the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson. And I want to start with what I think is a really revealing clip. Many of you will remember it. So the clip is Boris Johnson going into a hospital and he's confronted by a distraught father. Now, this distraught father does turn out to be a Labour activist, as many people were keen to point out just after. But I just want you to notice what the Prime Minister does.
There are not enough people on this ward. There are not enough doctors. There are not enough nurses. It's not well organised enough. Right. The NHS has been destroyed. Right. It's been destroyed. It's been destroyed. And now you come here for a press opportunity.
Well, actually, there's no press here.
What do you mean there's no press here? Who are these people?
Sir, will you just stop raising your voice?
I'm the hospital chief executive. We're here to actually here to find out how we can.
There's no press here, says the Prime Minister, surrounded by cameras, and you can hear the cameras going off. You can see, the man is literally looking at maybe 20 cameras. We can't see that side of things. There are flash bulbs going off. And the Prime Minister's first response, his default response, is to lie. Now, Joe, I'll bring in Joe here. You obviously run critical thinking, and I know that one of the things that you teach about is this difference between system one and system two thinking. So our system one thinking is where we're not doing hard work. We're just sort of relying on our sort of instincts. It's the sort of 2 + 2 = 4 thinking. And for me, when I watch this clip, I just think, well, what is this guy's system one thinking? His system one thinking is to lie.
So I would go even further than that. I think system one, system two is quite a useful way of thinking about this. And actually a good way of thinking about politicians like Boris Johnson is just to think of them as system one politicians. So if we take Daniel Kahneman's idea about system one and system two, system one is, as you say, that instinctive automatic response, which requires no critical effort, no mental effort at all. And that's very much part of Johnson's appeal, that he is very, very effective as a system one politician, as someone who speaks instinctively and from his gut and in a way that people respond to. Now, what's illuminating to me about that clip is not so much that his instinct is to lie, because if you think about it, it's such a bad lie, you'd never tell that. You'd never opt for that as a strategy in that situation. It's like immediately disproven. What it tells me about Johnson is not so much that he lies, as much as he constructs his reality as he goes. That's what makes him such a flawed human being, but also potentially a very, very effective politician in the 21st century. So Johnson just constructs his reality as he goes from situation to situation. Whatever he needs to be true at a given moment is true. And that's how he works. And I think that's actually how he works from what I can tell, from what I've read about him in his personal life. And it's just, he's just brought that straight into his political career. And the result is that when he speaks, and you can really see the difference with someone like Keir Starmer, who actually is worth thinking about as a kind of system two politician, right? Keir Starmer is kind of like always weighing everything. He's always thinking about the pros and cons of sticking or twisting in each given situation. And it's again deeply problematic for a political leader to do that, because what it means is there's no authenticity at all. So what the system one approach enables Johnson to do is just to connect with voters at this very instinctive gut level. And for the most part, if they like the version of reality he's creating, or they just enjoy the sense of the repartee of like, this guy would be great fun to go to the pub with, they don't really mind about whether the veracity of what he's saying. And I think
I feel like what we've chosen below us here for our names. I'm doing the system two thing of doing the very formal James Armstrong full name. Those of us listening to the podcast have got no idea what we're talking about, though.
Sure.
We've got our names Believers on YouTube, and Joe's just gone for the common man call me Joe, whereas I've gone for my full
Joe.
formal name.
We're James and Joe. I mean, to be fair, you made that mistake, or I don't know, one of us made a mistake. I also, when the camera enlarged, because obviously we're using this new thing today, and my glasses were suddenly like that, part of the thing, and I hadn't noticed. So the first 2 minutes was actually just me like doing this with my glasses while I was trying to talk. So
a nice example of what you were talking about is Sonia Purnell. Now, I've not read the book, but we both attended a talk by Sonia via the online mechanism of Microsoft Teams, and she was talking about when Johnson used to work at the Telegraph, and she described him as the arch procrastinator. He would spend all day doing whatever, pacing up and down his office, being Boris, really, not taking his job too seriously, which I would contend he still doesn't. And then she said that he would start shouting at a potted plant. I mean, this is a true story. He would just start screaming at a potted plant, and then she'd hear him typing furiously.
Yeah.
And then his column would appear out of that completely chaotic process. So notice what's not happened there. He hasn't done any serious journalism. He hasn't researched his story. He's not on the phone interviewing people. He's just in an entirely sort of egoistic, introspective universe where Mr. Johnson is the only thing that really matters. And again, that hasn't changed. And then he just fires out this screed. And remember about Mr. Johnson, notice I'm not calling him Boris, and I'd suggest that others don't do the same. Notice that when the EU referendum campaign first kicks off, he doesn't know what he thinks. He has to write 2 columns, and then he sits down. I'm just imagining now, he sits down with the 2 columns in front of him, and he's not thinking intellectually about what's best for the country. He's thinking about what's best for him. And he makes the decision, well, lots of my colleagues are going to go Remain. If I go for the Leave side, I'm going to be the most prominent politician on the Leave side alongside Michael Gove, and that's going to be my opportunity to become Prime Minister. I genuinely think it's that egocentric. He's not concerned about the country at all. He's just thinking about his naked political ambition.
Yeah, I mean, there's loads I want to come in on that, because I've thought a lot about Johnson's character, because I think he's really revealing about the state of UK politics. So I think, that for me, like Johnson becoming elected as Prime Minister was a really revealing moment to me about the political system that I was in, and actually had quite a radicalizing effect on me, because the last of my illusions that this kind of like stable center ground consensus would basically just produce like these middle of the road politicians who are essentially, fine at managing stuff. I mean, now I've come to the view that those politicians were, really, in some cases, well, hugely flawed in various different ways. But for Johnson to be able to become Prime Minister was just something that instinctively for me was a sign that the political reality as I had understood it didn't really exist. And so if we just go back, I'll go back to what we were talking about, and then we'll move forward to the referendum. So in terms of his journalistic career, don't forget Johnson's also sacked for lying, making up a quote from, I think, maybe his uncle, I can't remember, an older relative of his who's an historian. Johnson just makes up a quote that he thinks sounds good in the Times, and he's sacked.
I think it's in the Telegraph, isn't it?
No, he's sacked from the Times prior to the Telegraph. And the Telegraph, he's making stuff up left, right, and centre. But there's an important element in your account there that you missed off. His columns are really good. Everyone agrees on this. Everybody around Johnson agrees the stuff he's turning out is far superior to them in terms of just hitting home at the political world of Middle England. He just knows how to speak to it in a way that none of his peers can, partly because of his rhetorical style, partly because he's just willing to make stuff up in ways that they're not. So in both in terms of like moral approach and also just his flair, he's a cut above. And so of course he quickly advances to a lavish salary, and he becomes a sort of star columnist, and of course he then gets to edit The Spectator and so on. So his journalistic career, his political career, is built on the back of that kind of insanely chaotic process. where another really, really important element to remember about Johnson is he loves the high wire act. He's absolutely addicted to the edge. This is why sometimes he'll do things that, you know, people talk about him as this really effective politician, but he's often doing things that are way, way off in terms of like political logic, and which do get him into a lot of trouble. I'm thinking here about, for example, with Dominic Cummings over the course of the first lockdown. It was just an obvious call to remove Dominic Cummings right at the start when that scandal first broke. It was absolutely obvious political logic, and there are lots of different reasons you can argue about why doesn't Johnson sack Cummings, and it could be to do with his dependence on him and so on. But I also think there's a side to Johnson that just can't resist doing things that he probably shouldn't do from a logical perspective. So he's this weird mix of like, he is absolutely ruthlessly ambitious and he puts his own career first, but he also does things that are unnecessarily risky. So there's a really interesting dynamic there, and this is why his career is like interspersed with these quite dramatic falls, quite dramatic falls from grace. Also of course lying about his affair to Michael Howard. He was sacked from the shadow front bench. It
reveals something about his character, right? This is a man that doesn't expect to face consequences for his actions.
Yeah,
and part of the reason for that is that the media really, for a lot of his career, have treated him like, well, what he projects out into the world. He projects himself as a sort of unserious, jovial character, and still does, and somehow is still kind of getting away with this.
Yeah.
There's a tendency amongst the tabloid press with politicians to try and make us comfortable with them in a way that's not very serious and not very healthy in a democracy. So Margaret Thatcher becomes Maggie, Tony Blair becomes Tony, Boris Johnson becomes Boris. There's this sort of affectionate nicknames, and it's why I refuse to call him that. He's Mr. Johnson.
Yeah. I mean, it's not, of course, his first name, which is obviously...
And it's also not his first name. And actually,
yeah, it's his middle name.
I'm a teacher of politics, and on my Christmas quiz, one of the questions is, what is Boris Johnson's first name? And of course, they all get it wrong. It's Alexander. Boris de Pfeffel Johnson is his full name, so his first name is Alexander.
And good point on that, James, because that name just is itself a little reminder of something, which is, of course, he's got this deeply unrepresentative background. It's one of the really interesting things about Johnson is that he can be this man of the people, and yet his background is, very exclusive. Obviously, elite public school, attended Eton, Oxford, and really has spent his whole life, within this very narrow social circle with whom he is immensely comfortable. He's much more comfortable within that social circle. He's not comfortable at all if you actually watch him interact with people outside of that. But what he's really good at doing is this system one persona. I can't think of a better way of saying it at the moment. That the media just respond really well to, and so he absolutely is just kind of like, with the Brexit referendum, he's totally making his choices on the basis of like, what's in my political interests. But just one more thing on that, and I'm sure you will probably want to cue something up. We can see a little bit more of Johnson in action. But an extra thought on that is, for Johnson, kind of hardball politics is what you're there for. People like Johnson don't really believe in politics as a vehicle for social transformation. They see politics in the way that they studied the history of politics in their in their education as a kind of like contest of wills, a contest of big egos. And so the thing to do in politics is to win that contest. That's what you really, really care about. And so Johnson wouldn't be at all embarrassed, and he isn't really that embarrassed when he's challenged about the fact that he just called his position on the referendum really late. Because for him, that just shows how good he is at it. In his mind, that's not like something to be really embarrassed about. It just shows how skillful he is. That he can
I've written down on my little notepad here, like, just a question: how does he get away with it? And I am going to cue up a clip because I'm going to show you his style when he's being interviewed. And I guess what I notice when I watch Johnson being interviewed is he's got this mode of being where he He reaches for intangible metaphors. There's a kind of sort of thing that's going on where he doesn't want to say something or he can't. He tries to deflect. So he's developed this sort of style of responding to things, which is almost entirely artificial, which allows him to play this sort of bumbling creature that therefore becomes immune to criticism because, it's just Boris. Now I'm going to show the Eddie Mair interview. That there is another clip that I've queued up that I might show later, where he's really he's got his back against the wall with a journalist. He wants to show him, it's during the election, the photograph of a child sleeping on the floor of accident emergency. And when his typical repartee doesn't work, he just snatches the phone off the journalist because he doesn't know what else to do. But let's watch a little clip from Eddie Mair.
Let me ask you about some of the things that came up in the documentary.
Right. Well, I haven't seen it, so you.
No, but this happened in your life, so you know about this. The Times let you go after you made up a quote. Why did you make up a quote?
Well, this again, these are big terms for what happened. Well, I can tell you the whole thing. I mean, I think you sure our viewers wouldn't want to hear more about.
Well, all right. If you don't want to talk about the made-up quote, let me talk about something.
It was a long and lamentable story.
Okay, but you made a quote up.
Well, what happened was that I ascribed events that were supposed to have taken place before the death of Piers Gaveston to events that actually took place after the death.
You made
of Piers
something up.
Gaveston.
Let me ask you about another little.
I mean, I mildly sandpapered something.
Let me ask you about a barefaced lie.
Very embarrassing. I'm very sorry about it.
Let me ask you about a barefaced lie. When you were in Michael Howard's team, you denied to him you were having an affair. It turned out you were, and he sacked you for that. Why did you lie to your party?
Well, I mean, again, with great respect. On that, I never had any conversation with Michael Howard about that matter, and I don't.
You did lie.
Well, I don't propose to go into all that again.
I don't blame you.
No, well, why should I? I mean, I've been through that question a lot with the. Watch the documentary.
Okay.
Why don't we talk about something else?
The programme also includes. Well, this is about your integrity.
Okay.
The programme includes your reaction as you listen to a phone call, in which your friend Darius Guppy asks you to supply the address of a journalist, so that he can have him physically assaulted. The words "beaten up" and "broken ribs" are said to you. And you, having heard that, you tell your friend, Darius Guppy, you will supply the address. What does that say about you, Boris Johnson?
Well,
aren't you, in fact, making up quotes, lying to your party leader, wanting to be part of someone being physically assaulted? You're a nasty piece of work, aren't you?
Well, Eddie, I think all three things I would dispute.
Well, you don't factually dispute them.
Well, I do, and I could, if we had a long time, which we don't, I could explain that I think all three interpretations you're putting on those things aren't wholly fair. And certainly the final thing which you raise, which is the case of my old friend Darius. Yes, it was certainly true that he was in a bit of a state, and I did humour him in a long phone conversation, from which absolutely nothing eventuated.
Whenever you're asked about Prime Minister, and goodness knows my...
We'll leave it there. Well, you saw his style, didn't you? He's desperately trying to avoid the questions. He's desperate, and Eddie Mair is just not having it. And what's the reason that the interview is so well known is because it's very, very rare for interviewers to actually just not to not give him that space. Like Eddie Mair completely shuts all of that down, and you notice that Boris Johnson, he doesn't want to lie. He says, when asked, "You're not disputing the truth of any of this, are you?" He says, "Well, if we had longer, obviously, I'd go into this in a lot more detail." Well, what does that mean? And then he just says it's not fair. So he's not disputing the truth of the matter. He's just saying it's not fair. Now, I know I've just played quite a long clip, but I think it's worth listening to that phone call that Eddie Mair is talking about.
Boris, have you got this number? Gerard, look, there is a guy at the moment going through. You're brilliant. His files at home. Fantastic. But I am telling you something, Boris. This guy has got my blood up, all right? And there is nothing which I won't do to get my revenge. It's as simple as that. How badly are you going to hurt this guy? Not badly at all. I want to know. Okay, let me explain this. If this guy is serious, I'm fucking curious. I guarantee you, he will not be serious. How badly hurt? He will not have a broken limb or broken arm. He will not be put into intensive care or anything like that. He will probably get a couple of black eyes and a cracked rib or something like that. Nothing which you didn't suffer in rugby, okay? But he'll get scared, and that's what I want him to do. I want him to get scared. I want him to have no idea who's behind it, okay? Okay, I get it.
Okay, so pretty terrible there. But I just wanted to make sure we heard the clip. Boris Johnson's said in the interview nothing transpired as a result of it, but the very fact that he's willing to have that conversation, he's willing to go along with his friend Darius with his plan to supply an address to have a journalist beat up. Pretty damning about the man that is now a prime minister.
I mean, it is, but there are several things that are damning about that interaction, and some of them are quite subtle. So, I mean, on the one hand, yeah, I mean, the first thing to say is absolutely any other politician, it would be game over, right? And that in itself is quite interesting. Why is that? And also what you said, James, about the way Eddie Mair treats him in the interview. What's missing? There's one word that you could summarize it, and it's indulgence. Boris Johnson is used to being indulged. That is his fundamental modus operandi, is that he goes through life and people give him the benefit of the doubt. They smile at his silly jokes. They make him feel like he's the life and soul of the party. They get off on the persona that he creates, and they therefore let go things that are kind of that they might otherwise comment on. So that's number one, and that tells you a lot about how Johnson has been able to be successful and get away with things that other politicians wouldn't have done. A couple of really, really revealing little details. One is the bit where he starts talking about Piers Gaveston, which is so that he's made up this quote from an historian and it's about Piers Gaveston. But notice how he quite quickly retreats into this like arcane scholarly language. Now he does this a lot. He uses classics in this way. Johnson is not a particularly distinguished student of classics. He doesn't do particularly well at Oxford. He treats his studies, according to all his biographers, as just a sort of like an extra burden on the otherwise important, like pressing social engagements that he has in his kind of calendar while he's at Oxford. And so this, contrary to his public image, he's not this like great learned professor of the classics. He's just someone who can like riff on a few anecdotes and can remember the odd Latin quotation. But again, Johnson comes from a circle where stuff like that is like a badge of honor, and it's quite sort of, being able to do this kind of stuff is really like your sign that you belong to the in crowd. And I think one of the really interesting things about what is the nature of Johnson's appeal is that he kind of lets other people feel like they could join that as well, or that he's kind of he's inviting them into this kind of exclusive, quite fun club that he's a member of. And again, he's doing it with this quite like off the cuff repartee that again is very instinctive to him, and that just naturally creates quite a warm bond with his audience. So again, you've got another clue in there as to why he's like sneaking under the radar. But then the third detail in the interview that I love is the one you picked out, which is when he just can't resist saying in response to Eddie Mair's, I don't blame you, which is a very sarcastic comment. I don't blame you for not wanting to talk about this affair that you lied about. He says, yeah, why should I? And actually, it's a real flash of anger. It's a moment where he suddenly lets all of that guard down that he's quite carefully maintaining. And he's just quite honestly like, yeah, why the hell should I be accountable to anyone? I do what I like. And the fact that people ever make me accountable is, absolutely unacceptable. And that's the real Boris Johnson. That's the entitled little boy, the indulged little boy who lives underneath the public persona that everybody kind of, the Boris that everybody or lots of people warm to. I think for many people now that's worn thin, but enough of the population are still very much kind of falling for that aura. And I think what's striking is that's survived even this disastrous year. We won't go over now the legacy of the Conservative government in this year, but it's an appalling record of failure, and it would have finished off, I think, pretty much any other prime minister. And yet Johnson is looking like he will come out of it almost unscathed. That could change, but that's the current situation. So, this is a guy for whom the normal rules don't apply. You mentioned the interview that he conducted where he stole the journalist's phone. I've said this before on another podcast. That one action, if Jeremy Corbyn had done that in the interview campaign, we would be talking about that for 20 years as evidence of what a terrible political leader Jeremy Corbyn was and how he shouldn't have been anywhere near leading a political party. But because Johnson
since you mention it, let's watch that clip.
What was your reaction when you saw that shocking picture of Jack Willamette, the 4-year-old, on the floor of a hospital?
I have every possible sympathy with families and with patients.
How did you feel when you saw the photo, Prime
Minister? Don't have a good experience in the NHS, and what we want to do, and though I think most people do, the NHS on the whole does a fantastic job, and we back them and we support them. But we
have you seen the photo, Prime Minister? Have you seen the photo?
I've just been told about it by the BBC. We need to be making investments.
This is the photo.
We need to be making investments now, and that's why we're putting £34 billion.
This is a 4-year-old boy, Prime Minister, suspected of pneumonia, forced to lie on the floor on a pile of coats.
I understand. And obviously we have every possible sympathy for everybody who has a bad experience in the NHS. And that's why we're putting the record investment into the NHS now. But we cannot get on and make those investments. We cannot get on and turn this country around, put in 20,000 more police, upgrading 20 hospitals, 40 new hospitals.
I'm talking about this boy, Prime Minister. How do you feel looking at that photo?
Of course. And let me tell you that I haven't had a chance to look.
Why don't look at it now, Prime Minister?
I'll study it
look at it now. This is Jack Willamette.
If you don't mind, I'll give you an interview now. What we are doing is we are taking this country forward, and we are investing in the NHS. And what would be the worst thing possible would be to have a government that is mired in more deadlock, more disarray, and unable to move forward. So I have every sympathy with families.
You refuse to look at the photo. You've taken my phone, put it in your pocket, Prime Minister. His mother says the NHS is in crisis. What's your response to that?
It's quite an astonishing moment, isn't it? And we don't actually see that on camera. The camera pulls out and you suddenly see that the journalist is no longer holding the phone.
Well, you can see he makes the move and you're watching it carefully. You can see him it's almost like watching a conjurer act.
And he doesn't look at it. He just refuses to look at it. I'll study it later. What a strange thing to say.
Also notice the smirking at the start of the interview. That's kind of very characteristic Johnson. You'll see him a lot in any situation where he's under pressure. There's a lot of smirking. And then in that one, the smirking stops because he realizes he's in deep trouble. He realizes he's put himself in a position where he's actually really quite vulnerable. And Johnson vulnerable is not a pretty sight.
There's a question there, isn't there, about the extent to which he's ever really in that much trouble. I mean, we said this before about the nature of our electoral system. The nature of our electoral system is that you don't need to win a majority. So the last time what I would call a normal single-party government, so leaving aside the national government of the 1930s, the last time a normal single-party government won a general election with a majority was 120 years ago. So you don't need to win a majority to win a general election. What you need to do is to win just over 40% of the votes. And the issue with Johnson, it's a sort of confluence of things, but really it's about the tabloid press. It's about the sorts of people who read the tabloid press. I'm not criticizing them. I'm just noticing it as a phenomena. The tabloid press are willing to get behind Johnson. They're willing to create and sustain narratives that help him. They're willing to attack his rivals. So look at how they treated Jeremy Corbyn in both the 2017 and 2019 elections. And they're willing to just not scrutinize him. What was astonishing about the 2019 election was the extent to which Boris Johnson was able to say things that just weren't true. We're looking at, as we speak now, violence on the streets of Northern Ireland. Obviously, that violence has complicated routes. There are lots of different reasons why this is happening, but one of the reasons certainly is that Boris Johnson threw the DUP under the bus, threw the loyalist community under the bus by passing a Brexit deal that he knew would put a border down the Irish Sea. So they're now living with the consequences of that. And the Good Friday Agreement that was negotiated under John Major and then Tony Blair is looking really fragile at the moment, as is the future of the north of Ireland. So there's just a lack of scrutiny of this guy. And, you know, the moment for me, and I may well have mentioned this before, but the moment for me where it really, really, really hit home, I mean, it had hit home lots of different times, but I remember on this occasion, I texted people, and this was the moment where 100,000 people had died of coronavirus. And I remember texting several people saying, this is going to be a really bad day for the Prime Minister and the press. Finally, you know, it's got to be. How on earth could it not be? And then I looked, it got to 10 o'clock, and I like to look as the newspapers come in on an evening. There's a hashtag, tomorrow's papers today. And the newspapers started coming through on that hashtag. And it was astonishing. It was genuinely astonishing to see that the tabloid press had turned that story of 100,000 people dying. And let's just be clear about what that means. That means a Wembley stadium full of people dead, partly as a result of a prime minister who at the beginning of the crisis was uninterested. He wasn't attending COBRA meetings, who throughout the crisis made mistake after mistake after mistake, who wasn't listening to scientific advice, who was more concerned about the economy because he was convinced by the Chancellor than he was about the risks involved. That we get to 100,000 dead, and you know, he really is responsible for this. And the press turn it into a story about how we should feel sorry for the Prime Minister. Now, to be fair, I didn't expect to say to be fair, he gambled, as he does. That's what the Prime Minister, if he's good at anything, it's gambling. It's taking risky decisions. The one thing that's gone right was the vaccine rollout. But let's be clear about why it went right. The Prime Minister was willing to take a huge gamble and to pre-commit to these vaccines where, at a point where there was no evidence they'd be effective. Now, that's turned out to be a good strategy, but it didn't have to be the case that was a good strategy. It could have been that these vaccines just didn't work. And then what would we have been talking about? We'd be talking about billions and billions of pounds down the drain on vaccines that didn't work. And so the reason why we got ahead was because under this Prime Minister, we were willing to take a risk. And that is going to rescue the man from a calamitous series of errors that were totally avoidable. And the reason he makes these errors is because he's a fly by the seat of the pants Prime Minister. He's the ultimate. What did he say about Cameron? Essay crisis Prime Minister. I mean, this guy is the ultimate essay crisis Prime Minister. He's not interested in detail. But leaving all of that aside, I say he's not interested in detail. He's also not interested in having a philosophy, having, you know. So when I reflect about this, and I think about what's the one question I could ask the Prime Minister to totally floor him, I would say, which political philosopher do you most admire?
No, he'd give you an answer straight away.
He wouldn't. He doesn't have a clue.
No. He's way, you know. Johnson, he would say, what would he say? Take Burke, or he'd say Peel. The thing about Johnson is he knows his lines, and if you asked him what's your political philosophy, he'd say freedom, individual liberty, sovereignty of parliament. He'd be able to, he knows this stuff. He's really good at it. You know, people get Johnson wrong a lot of the time. You know, he knows his audience really, really fucking well. That is what he's good at.
You've just won.
Yeah, I think it was worth it. I think, you know, it was an important point. You know, it's true. It's what he's good at, and he knows it in his gut. He knows exactly how to communicate. He knows how to get the pulses racing, and he knew that he could win the election in 2019 by unifying that 45% of the vote which were basically could be aligned on essentially identity politics. Right, it's interesting, isn't it? A lot of the right will talk about identity politics. We really don't like it because it's the right stock in trade is identity politics. You know, like post Brexit, that was what they realised would work. Essentially, white, socially conservative voters could be told there are these nasty, threatening people coming to take away everything you hold dear, culturally, but also, you know, economically as well. You know, so I'm talking here about, you know, reasonably affluent kind of homeowners, you know, living in parts of the North and the Midlands, the so-called Red Wall. Johnson just knew that you could unite that section of the electorate with really, really well-targeted rhetoric. And that's what he did. But bear in mind, it wasn't like there was another option. You know, I don't know, some people sometimes talk about this as just like, it's just this amazing strategy. It's just like, what else were you going to do? Like, that was what they had to do. And the thing that distinguishes Johnson is not that he's a brilliant strategist. The thing that distinguishes Johnson is his ruthlessness. So with Theresa May, not a politician that I admire, but she has some compunction about the kind of what she's willing to say and the extent to which she's willing to bend the truth. She has some compunction around that. And Johnson has absolutely none. So for him, it doesn't matter. You've got a goal and you just shoot at the goal and you don't care about anything other than whether it goes in. And the thing about that is, as I've said before, if it goes in, you did it right. That's end of story. You don't relitigate the 2019 election later on and say, well, maybe morally it was a little bit, you know, dubious to start talking about no checks on Northern Irish trade because, you know, that could have some pretty heinous political consequences. You don't care. You won the election. You're worried about how to win the next election in 3 or 4 years' time.
Yeah, and that's sort of,
there's a fundamental amorality in how he thinks, which makes him really effective.
Which is, well, exactly. So if we were going to say one nice thing about the Prime Minister, he's very good at winning elections. He just doesn't know what to do once he's got the serious job of actually governing the country. Shall we leave it there?
Just on that,
I'll let you wrap up. Do you want to wrap up?
Okay. I mean, so Johnson knows how to win elections in the context, the political context that he knows, which is you have a sympathetic tabloid press. You can basically rely on Eurosceptic rhetoric. You can bluster on about like national achievements and no one will really critically evaluate them. You know, if you give Boris Johnson like Jeremy Corbyn's hand, he'd have absolutely no chance. Like he'd be completely, absolutely at sea. So he understands the political context that he works in really well. And he knows how to, as I say, he knows how to like galvanize his audience. And I think, you know, that's hopefully what we've shown you in the clips we've shared with you today, that Johnson is an instinctive politician like almost no one else. He's almost unmatched. In fact, I would say he is unmatched in his capacity to speak instinctively to the instincts and impulses of like socially conservative Middle Britain. And he's been rewarded for that with an electoral majority. Now, how is that going to unfold? Well, it's going to depend on two things, I think. One is, will there be any change in the way the media deals with Johnson over the course of the next 2 to 3 years? Will there be any recognition of the way in which he's been systematically indulged and efforts to change that? The second thing is Johnson himself, because as I said earlier, Johnson is addicted to the High Wire Act. If things are going reasonably well and ticking on, he gets bored. He will do things that are self-destructive. He will then try and like salvage the situation, but I guarantee you, between now and the next election, Johnson will do self-destructive things. How self-destructive? How much of a price will he pay? We'll have to wait and see. But you know, he remains the dominant figure in British politics, despite the events of the past year.
Okay, we'll leave it there. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.